Sunday School teacher, thank you for joining us for our time of preparation and study. I'm Tim Smith with Sunday School University, and today we begin our new study in the Old Testament book of Job. And so that's where we're going to be, and we're working on the lesson for Sunday, June the 6th. We're going to be in chapter 1. We're going to be looking at verses 8 through 22. The title of this lesson is Faith Tested. I'm sure that you're familiar with the book of Job, but just to help us have a little bit of an introduction and knowing the purpose of Job. Basically, we see this in the book of Job. It's given to us to give an answer to the question of why good people suffer. We see that in the book of Job. We also see that Job was given to us to refute the belief that people who enjoy worldly success are worthy of such blessings. In other words, if you have a good life, then that means you've done good. And vice versa. If bad comes in your life, that means that you've done something bad. And so Job was given to us to help us to understand that's not the way it works. And then also Job helps us to explore the question of whether human beings will worship God without consideration of what they receive in return. In other words, will people who have difficulty worship God even though there's nothing for them in the end? And then finally, Job was given to us to show that God is present with and supportive of His people even when they cannot perceive His presence or even His activity. And so that's why we've got the book of Job. In this session, we'll think through how we might respond to God if we suddenly lost everything that we hold dear, or all of that we hold on to give us meaning and fulfillment. The point of this lesson is that believers show the depth of their faith in adversity. Job was an extraordinary individual. He had been blessed incredibly, and his life was pleasing to God. So he had the blessings of life, and he had lived a life that was pleasing to God. And we see that Satan urged and argued that God's blessings on Job were the reason for Job's righteous living and his commitment to God. In other words, Satan said, if you didn't do so good to Job, then he wouldn't be so good to you. And so that's where we pick up. Look at verse 8. And then it says, Then the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil. Satan answered the Lord, Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the work of his hand, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he owns, and surely he will curse you to your face. Very well, the Lord told Satan, everything he owns is in your power. However, do not lay a hand on Job himself. So Satan left the Lord's presence. And so here we see permission granted. The writer of the book of Job assumed that the audience would simply recognize that Satan's unusual audience with the Lord happened because the Lord allowed it. We didn't get into a great theological discussion in the first few verses of chapter 1. How did Satan get there? Why was Satan there? Satan was there. But also it is important for us to know that the word Satan means accuser or adversary. The term Satan was that of an accuser, an adversary. And then later on it was used as the name of the devil. Sort of like when you and I order a soft drink at a restaurant, we usually say Coke, and that may be anything from a Dr. Pepper to a Sprite. We refer to Q-tips. They're all Q-tips, but that's the name brand of one. So Satan here, I believe that this is literally Satan, but the term that is used there is accuser or adversary. We see in verse 7, the conversation begins with God asking Satan where he had come from, but the way the question is phrased in verse 7 is not where have you been? It's more of why are you here? God knew what Satan had been up to. He's all powerful, all knowing. He knew. And so God's asking Satan, what are you doing here? And what do you want? Verse 8, God asked if Satan had noticed his servant Job. Job had been submitted to the Lord. He was perfect in his integrity. He fears God. He has a relationship with God that is built on submission. He is in awe of God. He worshiped God. And we also see that Job ran away. He shunned evil. He didn't want to have anything to do with sin and evil. God was saying there in verse 8, did you notice how good of a man Job is? And what he was doing is he's drawing a comparison between Job and Satan. Satan, did you notice how good of a man Job is? Did you notice that he's like me and not anything at all like you? Look at verses 9 and 10. And there we see that Satan counters by saying the only reason that Job is any good is because all the stuff you've given to him. In verse 11, Satan asks God to take away all of Job's material possessions. And if you do that, God, and you take all of his stuff away, yeah, he's going to be like everybody else, and he's going to curse you just like I do. In verse 12, we see that God allowed Satan to take everything from Job except not to touch Job himself. Well, look at verses 13 through 19. One day when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and reported, while the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, the Sabines swooped down and took them away. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. He was still speaking when another messenger came and reported, God's fire fell from heaven. It burned the sheep and the servants and devoured them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. That messenger was still speaking when yet another came and reported, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, made a riot on the camels, and took them away. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And then in verse 18, he was still speaking when another messenger came and reported, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, and suddenly a powerful wind swept in from the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on the young people so that they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Wow. The attack comes. We see 4 tragedies taking place in Job's life. We know there in verse 13 that we see the animals. We know from chapter 1, verse 3, that he had over 1,500 work animals. And these animals were stolen by a nomadic band of marauders. And they killed all of the workers but one. And then we see that God's fire, what we would consider to be a lightning strike or several lightning strikes, caused the death of all of the sheep and all of the shepherds. And when you look at this, the way it says in verse 16, God's fire fell from heaven. Satan did this to send a message. He was saying, hey, Job, the God whom you have been so devoted to caused your losses. And then these bad reports, they just keep coming. Another nomadic group of marauders stole the camels and killed all but one of the workers. And then finally, the report came that a tornado, that's the only way we can understand it to be something like a tornado. And if you've ever lived through a tornado, you can relate to wind hitting the four corners of the house. But the house collapsed and killed all of Job's family, his children. Look at verse 20. And there we see, then Joseph stood up, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground and worshipped, saying, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Throughout all of this, Job did not sin or blame God for anything. So here we see Job's trust, his faith maintained. We see there in the first part of verse 20 that Job's faith held strong. It says that he stood up. That's important for us to see, that he didn't just wallow in self-pity, that he just didn't fall off and say, oh, woe is me. He stood up, and in standing, he says, I'm going to make it through this difficult time. But we see that he tore his robe. It's the outer garment. It reflected the wearer's prosperity and the status of importance in the community. He was that broken. Also, we see that he shaved his head. Thick, flowing head of hair, full of gray hair, probably for Job at this point in his life, was a sign of wisdom and success. He was saying that all of that is gone. All that I have had, all that I have gained is gone. And we see in verses 20, the latter part of verse 20 through 21, that although Job was filled with grief and despair, he worshiped the Lord. He affirmed that human life and all of its material blessings are gifts from God to be managed, not owned and controlled by man. He affirmed that God's sovereign rule over human life. And he affirmed that in either prosperity or adversity, the Lord is worthy of his trust and his worship. In verse 22, he didn't sin. He didn't act like so many people act, that when bad comes, they act bad. When difficulty comes, they become difficult. And many times people justify their actions and their attitudes and their words by saying, bad came to me, so it's okay for me to be bad. I deserve to be bad. That's not what Job did. He didn't get angry at God because these things had happened. So what are the points of this Bible study? I've given you those 3 quick summaries in your listening guide. Number 1, Satan seeks opportunities to attack God's faithful followers. No doubt about that. God's after us as God's followers. He wants us to fail and be unproductive. Number 2, believers aren't immune from calamity and loss. Hey, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that life's going to be a bed of roses. We're not immune. And number 3, believers can worship God even in the midst of life's challenges, knowing that God is sovereign. We may not understand it all. We may not be able to even enjoy. But the truth is, God's in control, and we can trust Him. So what are some things that we can do as we teach this lesson? I've given you some of those to create interest. I'm giving you some ideas about challenging at the end. Remember, you get their interest real quick. You spend the majority of your time studying the Scriptures, applying those Scriptures, and then you come to the end with an application, a conclusion. One of the things that I've put in your notes is this. Ask if there's someone in the group that's going through a difficult time. Ask them to briefly share and then close by having the group pray for them. You may have someone in your group that's going through a difficult medical situation or a loss of a job or the challenge of a wayward child. But there's somebody that's going through your group that may be feeling like Job. Well, why don't you pray for them, encourage them, help them during this time? Well, the title of the lesson is Faith Tested. The point is, believers show the depth of their faith in adversity. Well, I'll be praying for you as you teach this coming Sunday. God bless you.